Hello.
I'll take a mic.
Can you hear me? Yeah?
I can hear you.
We get signal. Main screen turn on. Move zig
It's you.
for great justice. Okay.
Yeah. Are we ready to start?
Are we ready to go? Now is the time. Welcome, everybody. This is how to use Puppet like an adult, aka Pup 201, turn your cell phone on. Thank you. Next slide.
My name is Ben Kero. I'm a member of IT over at Mozilla, and I use Puppet. I'm going to stand over here now. We use Puppet every day, especially me. I'm this guy up here on the left, if you couldn't tell. And we have to use a lot of advanced features of Puppet, things that don't exist, and a lot of patterns that a lot of smaller shops, a lot of problems that smaller shops will encounter as they keep using Puppet. And so we're here today to tell you a little bit about some of the things that you might run into and some of the things that you're doing now that might come back to bite you in the ass later.
Basically. So as I said, he's Ben Kero. I'm Maher. Work in IT ops. I'm a web operations engineer. Do a lot of hacking on Puppet. So we're going to, exactly what Ben said, tell you about how to avoid a lot of mistakes that commonly happen, especially as you grow and the Puppet implementation becomes larger within your environment. Before we get to that, however, very, very brief IT at Mozilla. Very brief overview of IT at Mozilla. That's IT at Mozilla. You're looking at it. Picture's a little old. We've got data centers, 2 big data centers in the United States. We've got other data centers all over the world. And obviously, we need a way to manage all of that infrastructure, a centralized way to manage all that infrastructure. Going onto machines by hand and editing text files is ridiculous at this scale. So of all the solutions that were out there, Puppet was the one that was picked, more or less by random, really. Just happened to be Puppet.
Yeah,
so we've learned some lessons.
Yeah, we actually came to Puppet from 2 tools before. We use BCFG2, which is a really old tool written in Python, and all of the configuration is done in XML, and it's horrific to maintain. And
Nightmare.
CF Engine, which we used, but really didn't lend itself well to the kind of infrastructure that we had.
Yeah. There's also Chef. If you guys are familiar with configuration systems, Chef's also quite interesting. We just don't use it.
Yeah.
There you go. Moving right along. Ooh, that was weird.
Yeah.
Wow. That might be a little graphic.
They didn't like your graphic?
Didn't like my graphic.
Oh, well.
All right. Data does not exist in logic. What are we talking about when we talk about this? Now, I'm assuming everybody here at least is a little bit familiar with Puppet. I'm hoping everybody is a little bit familiar with Puppet. And the idea that Puppet can have modules, right? Modules are where the work happens. One of the great Puppet sins when you're implementing Puppet for the first time is that you make your modules highly specific to your environment. What does that mean? It means that you've got business-specific data inside of the module. This is a no-no. Should absolutely not happen.
A nice example of this is putting passwords inside your modules for servers or something like that. Things that really should be separated from your modules to both make them more reusable and to prevent something like you decide to open source your module and you accidentally don't put a password. You don't take back a password.
Our bullet points aren't showing up. That's bad. That is bad. What if we... What'd you do? What manner of sorcery? Wow. That's why he's the problem solver. So, no business data in modules. We're going to explain why that is in a second, but again, very important. No business data in modules. Business logic, on the other hand, that's cool. Why is that? Because logic is portable. Logic can be taken from one environment and put into another environment. Data, much harder. For example, a password. The passwords we use Very different from the passwords you use. I hope. It'd be bad if they were the same. Logic, on the other hand, we run Apache. You run Apache. Probably we run Apache much the same way. Make sense? Aces? Nice. Where do you put data if you can't put it in the modules? If you have to take it out of where one might put it in Puppet because it's easy, but wrong, where do you get it from? External sources. Next slide. External data sources.
Yeah, we're going to talk about a couple of the ways where you can actually keep your data in Puppet without actually having to resort to sticking it in modules. And this has actually undergone renovation recently with the release of Puppet 3. And there's actually, if you look at people who have had Puppet installed for a long time, there are very different ways to do this. And Hiera is one of the newest ones, and PuppetDB are the two new ones. And they both are basically ways to solve this problem. And so, for instance, PuppetDB allows you to make API queries against Puppet. And so you can grab data, you can do whatever you want. It also allows you to use the concept of store configs without having horrific technical implementation details and performance problems.
We have some more slides actually on each of these afterwards. The biggest thing to grok at this stage, we talk about external data sources, is that the word external is a bit of a misnomer. External doesn't necessarily mean outside of Puppet. It simply means that you're not putting it in modules. It simply means that you're not putting it in places within Puppet where it can't be easily reused by someone else. Data can go into Puppet, you just have to do it the right way. And that's what we mean when we say external data sources. Take it out of the easy spots, put it in the hard spots, because that's where it has to go. And that's what we're going to talk about for the next couple of slides. Hiera. Hiera is a big one. If you're a part of the Puppet community, you know who R.I.Fine.R is. He wrote Hiera, originally as an external tool, but now it's directly integrated into Puppet 3. It is a lightweight, pluggable, hierarchical database. Jargon, but it accurately describes exactly what it is. It has a lot of different backends. What does that mean? Well, in that, actually helps to describe what Hiera is as a tool. It's an interface. You store data somewhere, right? Your passwords, configurations, MD5 sums, whatever it's going to be. You put them somewhere. How do you get that data into Puppet? You need some way to translate, some sort of interface layer between that data and Puppet. Hiera can be that layer. Standard in Puppet 3, as I mentioned. And very, very easy to use inside of your manifests. 2.6, you'd be Hiera something, something being the thing you're looking for, probably a variable. Now it's just lookup because it's standard. They're trying to sort of remove the idea of Hiera being separate. You can also do scoping with it. For those of you who are familiar with Puppet, you know what scoping is all about. It's hellish. Well, it continues to be hellish in Hiera, but nonetheless you can do it. Do you want to mention about GPG?
Right, there's a concept of Hiera GPG, which is like a plugin for GPG, and it allows you to keep things like passwords GPG encrypted and only decrypts them as they go to be installed on servers. That way, if you do have machine compromises, you can lower the amount of information that an attacker gets. This is a separate module. It's a little bit difficult to set up, but if you're concerned about such things, it's there for you.
Exactly. It's not a bad idea. A quick note on the backends that you can use for Hiera. YAML is probably the most popular one, so you can actually store all of your configuration data in a very simple, easy to edit, easy to manage YAML files. This can even be done in an automated fashion. If you've got a database, an inventory database with stuff in it, you can just export that to YAML files, you can pull it out. JSON files, JSON data sources, especially if you have already a web service that spits out JSON that has information you need. You can use Hiera for that. You can actually even use Puppet itself as a backend, which is some inception nonsense, and we're not going to get into it. But it's possible. PuppetDB.
Yeah, I talked briefly about this before. It's just a a new way of having store configs, which is a way where Puppet Puppet hosts in the resources that Puppet is giving to them can cite other things, so you can bring in the configuration of other hosts which are managed by Puppet and then run things based off that. So this is really common if you're trying to do your monitoring or like graph building, and through this you can basically tell your monitoring server about all these other hosts that exist in Puppet, and that way you can automate your monitoring.
It's very nice.
That's one way you can do it, and that's a tiny little class that kind of shows you. You have declaration, and then you have your little spaceship operator here that collects everything and does something with it.
So this looks kind of scary if you've never worked with the syntax before. I assure you that visually, it's a lot worse than actually implementing it. Again, the whole idea behind store configs is functionally just a way to have one node know something about another node. Again, if you've used Puppet in the past, or even if you've used other type of configuration management systems in the past that are node-specific, it can be difficult when you're applying a state configuration to one node to know anything about another node. Store configs is a way around that. It's a way that when the manifest or whatever is being applied to one node can have knowledge about other nodes in your infrastructure. New hotness?
Yeah.
It's the new hotness. It's basically what it is. It was old and busted before. Nobody used it. It's terrible. Store configs. Now it's the new hotness with the PuppetDB backend. Actually, we're going to come back and we're talk about PuppetDB a little more later on and some of the other ways that you can use it within your ecosystem. Finally, ext lookup and others.
Right, yeah, ext lookup is basically the old way that you would do things that you can now do with the tools of... we didn't have any slides on that yet?
Oh, yeah, no, we got some stuff now.
Okay,
yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, ext lookup is very simple. Oh, thank you. ext lookup is very simple, and it's very simple to use, and it's simple to understand. The disadvantage is that it's too simple. You can't do some of the things that you would expect to do or expect to be able to do, which is a little bit difficult. It's the most common one. So if you're going someplace and they already have a Puppet installation, odds are they're using this. It's kind of the most common thing.
It's the most common one. It was implemented to solve a very simple solution, which is exactly what we described. The data is elsewhere. ext lookup actually, by default, reads from CSV files. So for example, the use case was, quite literally, I've got an Excel spreadsheet that's got a bunch of inventory information in it. I've exported it to a CSV. Can I use that in Puppet? And that was sort of the inception of ext lookup. Obviously, as Ben mentioned, it's very simple, probably too simple. Uses files as backends, and you can see the syntax of it. If we remember a few slides earlier, looks very much like the Hira syntax. There's a reason. People are used to this. So in order to encourage people to use more complex mechanisms that give them a greater flexibility, they kept the syntax the same. So the transition, if you already have manifests that use ext lookup to using Hira, should be relatively straightforward. There are some others in the families. There's YAML var, there's Dilly. The big thing to remember now is that if you're installing Puppet for the first time, or you're redoing Puppet in your environment, and you're thinking about how can we externalize data, don't use ext lookup. Just don't do it. It's deprecated, it's old, it's not going to do what you want anymore. Fair enough? Fair enough?
Yes. These are kind of some of the more practical things that we thought you might want to know, and that's where to find pre-built modules. And there's a time to write your own module, just like there's a time to download somebody's software versus writing your own modules or finding someone else or writing your own software. And this is pretty simple. There's only a couple sources where Puppet modules are really popular, and you kind of do them in this order. You look at Puppet Labs provides Puppet Forage, which has a lot of nice modules in there. Their version, they have tests. One of the problems is there are many modules in there, and you might not find the one you want. And the ones you want in there might, and I'm going to get to this a little later, might be a little difficult and use some features that you don't understand or are not comfortable with implementing. Beyond that, The next one is GitHub, and GitHub is nice. You probably use it already for managing code, and many people manage their Puppet modules in there. As a matter of fact, whenever I have the chance and I write Puppet modules, that's where they go. And the usual process is everybody makes their GitHub modules or everybody writes their Puppet modules in GitHub repositories, and when they feel confident, they mark it, tag a version, and then throw it onto the forage. And so it's the next place to go. And then beyond that, the next step is to actually just use Google and find companies or reputable sources. Things like that are nice. For instance, the Wikimedia Foundation has a lot of their Puppet modules online. They're not on GitHub or the Forge, but they're very vetted, they're very widely used, and unfortunately, there's a lot of companies like this which have excellent Puppet modules, but they make it slightly difficult to find.
Yeah. Generally speaking, though, the Puppet Forge should be your first stop. All the Puppet Forge modules are generally considered to be stable. A lot of them are developed in collaboration with Puppet Labs, so it should be the first place you look, generally speaking. Next question, though, is that module right for me? So you found a module. You found it on the Forge, looks good. The description seems to describe the problem you're attempting to solve. Is it what you want, though? How can you tell? How do you know? Well, there's a couple of questions that you're going to have to ask. One of them is the distro, flavor, operating system. Do these match your requirements? Remember, Puppet's configuration management system manages the state of machines. But not every machine is the same. Some machines are Windows, some are Red Hat Linux, some are SUSE, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, that means there are system-level differences, software-level differences. Module written for Red Hat Enterprise Linux 5 may not work on a Ubuntu 12.04 machine. So that's an important consideration. Complexity?
Yeah, as I touched on earlier, if you're looking at this module and if you don't realize how it works, if it's using some things you're not comfortable with, like stored configs, and I've dropped modules on the floor because they were a perfect module, except I was not comfortable with this concept of using it. And so that was completely the right solution, because I could have implemented it, but if something went wrong, I would not know how to fix it. So a good rule of thumb is if you don't understand how it works, or you can't expect your team to understand how it works, then it's not worth it.
Just as an aside, I understand that this might go a little bit into the hacker ethos, which is if it's too complex, spend some time and learn it. That's a very good approach. If it is too complex, you don't understand it, dive into the documentation, read the man pages, get comfortable with it, and that's fine. Highly encourage you to do that. What you want to avoid is implementing something you don't understand. That's the sin. Okay? Spend the time, learn it, get your team up to speed, and once everybody's comfortable with it, then deploy it. If you can't sit down in one sitting, read through the module code, and understand what it does, do not deploy it into production. Should go without saying, but I've seen this happen. Finally, popularity.
Right. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. If you're trying to deploy something like a MySQL server, there's going to be hundreds of Puppet modules for deploying a MySQL server. And so you can use the popularity of a module to kind of gauge the quality of it, or gauge the amount of support you're going to be able to receive if you try to use it.
Yeah, so it's a form of vetting. Do not be afraid to use popular modules. Reasonably straightforward. That brings us to the next slide. Recommended pre-built modules. So we've said, where do we get modules? How do we figure out if the module is right for us? Well, what are some good modules you can use today to help you in your environment? These two. I just want to mention very briefly. Puppet Labs Firewall and Puppet Labs Cloud Provisioner. They're popular, right? They're functional, it's good. They're vetted by Puppet, which means probably going to work with Puppet. They work on a lot of different operating systems. That's nice. Okay? And if you look through the code, it's not even that bad to understand. They've written these to be modules that anybody can sit down and read and use. So that's good. What do they do? Firewall builds IP tables, rule sets. So if you're in an environment where you have to manage a lot of IP tables, don't have a really good way to do that, would like to do it in Puppet, that's the module. It produces clean IP tables rule sets. It does what you think it's going to do. And of course, that's the most important thing. The second one I wanted to mention is Cloud Provisioner. Puppet has an enterprise level of software. It's called Puppet Enterprise for creative. And one of the big selling points of Puppet Enterprise is that you can do cloud deployments. Deploy to the cloud, spin up instances, deploy your operating software to those instances, so on and so forth. And you do it through this very pretty web interface. And that's one of the big selling features of Puppet Enterprise. But not everybody uses Puppet Enterprise. You don't want to pay for it. Your installation is not big enough to warrant it. You just want to play around with it for whatever reason. You can get all of that functionality with the Cloud Provisioner module. It's their Cloud Provisioner. You don't get the web interface, but it exists, and you can use it, and you can deploy to the cloud. So if you're thinking, I want to learn more about Puppet, I want to start looking at some bit more high-level modules, bit more complex modules that are themselves very functional, these are two good places to start. Unfortunately, you might someday run into a circumstance where you cannot find a module to do what you want. In which case, rule your own.
Yep, and there are several rules that you should probably follow when rolling your own modules. One is you just kind of want to be as generic as possible with it, so you can, I mean, it's kind of, if you're familiar with an object-oriented approach, you want to make your modules generic, your objects generic, so you can reuse them in circumstances that you didn't expect to be using it before.
That's exactly true. When we say generic, it doesn't have to mean useless. It just means reusable. You don't want to have to take 15 different machines that do things in subtly different ways and write 15 modules. That's ridiculous. Generic means reusable. It means exportable. It means not only can you use it in other instances, but maybe other people can use it. Parameterized.
Yep.
That's a good word.
Parameterized classes are important, and they're one of the things that makes Puppet really useful and cool. Instead of just having your host definition and say, I want to include the Apache class, you could say, I want to include the Apache class. By the way, it should listen on port 81 instead of port 80. And it allows you to make your modules, one, more generic, and two, it allows you to pass the data in. So it allows you to abstract like your web server password or something like that from your module without having to do weird things.
Weird things indeed. Parameterized class is very simple to use. It's like a definition that you only use one time. You pass variable data to it, and it's just like a class, except it's more malleable. Third important point, documentation. Modules need to be documented. Everything needs to be documented, always. In Puppet, this is also true. What does this mean? Do we put it on a wiki? Yeah, of course. But it also means documentation within the manifest itself. There's ways to generate documentation automatically from Puppet manifests. There's tools out there to do that. They're well known, they're well respected. So when you're building your manifests, you're building your modules, you're putting your Puppet infrastructure together, pick an automated documentation tool. The one that comes with Puppet is not a bad one. And write your manifests with this syntax in mind. That way, as your team develops modules, as you work on hack-on manifests, as it becomes bigger and larger and more people are playing with it within your environment, your automated documentation generator, which runs maybe once a day by itself, spits out documentation to your company's wiki. Boom, done. Very nice. Finally, published.
Right, and we're going to get to another slide about this in a second, but with the publishing, when you feel confident that your module is in a good state, then you can publish it, you can put it on GitHub, you can get some feedback about it, and when you feel confident about that, you can submit it to Puppet Forge, and that way it can be used by many people who are looking for modules from the Forge.
Exactly. So this is a way that you can participate in the open source world with Puppet. You don't have to be a Puppet developer, right? I'm not a Puppet developer. Well, I've submitted a couple code patches, but I'm not a Puppet developer. How can I participate in the open source world from the context of Puppet as a system administrator? This is a good way to do it. I've written manifests, written modules, all sorts of ways of doing things. They're nicely documented. Where do you put them? You put them on the GitHub. You put them on your Puppet Forge. Share with the community. So, you want to roll your own module. You've got these principles in mind. You're ready to go. Now what? Module template. All modules that you write on your own should use this. It's module template. It's very simple. You go to your command line. You type puppet module generate. Makes sense? Author could be you, could be your company, some sort of unique identifier, and dash the name of the module. This will build that, which is the skeleton or the basic framework for generic modules that can be reused, that can be posted to Puppet Forge, that can be put on GitHub. And if you use this every time, you're not only using something that's extensible, you're using something that's standardized. That's good for you, and that's good for everybody.
Yep. And inside some of these modules, like the manifest init.pp file, it has some nice text in there that gives you the format that your documentation is expected to be in. And then from that, it can just grab that, and since it's already there and you know how to put it in, it can successfully parse it and generate documentation for Sphinx or put it on your wiki or something else.
Exactly.
Additionally, it also gives you tests. And so, you get code coverage in terms of tests automatically just by using this tool, which is really valuable.
Exactly. If anybody here was in the previous presentation about doing continuous deployment for operating system packages, which is actually pretty good, should be able to recognize this is simple spec testing, right? If you're not doing spec testing in your environment, I highly suggest you start doing it. If you are doing spec testing, good for you. You can do it with Puppet also. So you've built your Puppet skeleton. You got some documentation, maybe just some bare bones things, what you want to do with it. Very nice. You're ready to write a class. You're ready to actually write some meat, some functionality, some logic that's actually going to do something. Parameterized classes, which we touched on very briefly a moment ago. Now we're going to talk about it in depth. This is, I hope everybody's awake for this one, the most important slide in this presentation. Just those two words. I could have come and just spray painted those two words on the wall, talked for 5 hours. This is the most important thing that I want you to take away, parameterized classes. Okay? Good? Awesome. Let's talk about them. Similar definitions. Definitions like functions. Okay? So reusable. They look like this. Anyone want to walk us through that?
Sure. Yeah. If you're not familiar with Puppet syntax, or even if you are, I can explain it a little bit. We have class, and obviously, and some daemon is the name of our class, and these are the parameters that we are passing to our class, which are just like a function. They're variables. So we have our directory, we have our config, and we have ensure. And ensure has a default value of true. And we can use these anywhere in the class. We can even define them, or we can redefine them somewhere in the class along a conditional.
Careful.
Sort of.
Redefining them is tricky.
It is. But the nice thing about this is that you can have things in here, and you can have conditionals. So that way you can, if ensure is false, for example, you can then make sure that the service is not running and the file is not there.
Precisely.
So in this way, this module just became a lot more extensible.
Again, the important takeaway from this is not necessarily the syntax, right? I mean, syntax is syntax. Everybody can learn this. It's fine. It's just typing, right? Put your fingers in the right spot. You'll get things that come out, and that's fine. The important idea here is the why. Why do we have to use parameterized classes? We have to use parameterized classes for all the reasons that we've led to up until this point. To keep things generic, to keep things extensible, to keep things reusable, to keep things modular, to keep things understandable for other people. If you're your own system administrator and you've got 4 machines and you're running Puppet, do whatever you want, right? But when you're on a very large team around the world, different time zones, I mean, there are people I work with that I don't ever talk with because they're awake when I'm asleep. And if I have to write a Puppet manifest that's going to do something, and I want that person that I literally never talk to be able to understand it and apply it in their situation from the same organization. this is basically the only way to do it. All right? It's the only way to avoid writing the same module over and over and over and over and over to do subtly different things. That's bullshit. You write one module, and you allow that one module to do those subtly different things. Now, maybe you already know this, and I'm preaching to the converted. But if you didn't know this, now you do. Very important. The last thing I just want to mention very briefly on this is, if you look at the syntax very briefly, class, sum, daemon, dir, config, and sure equals true. In this case, dir and config don't have default values. You can see that they do not have default values, whereas ensure does. Okay? If you can sanely provide usable defaults, that's a good thing. There are going to be instances where there's no sane default. There is no sane action that can be taken without specifying some environment variable or something, and that's fine. But if you can specify default values, sane default values, that's a really, really good idea. Why? Because then when you are writing your manifest, you're putting that module into place, you just go include the module, and it works. And that's very nice. Most important slide. We're leaving it now. Syntax and style. This is my bugaboo.
Yeah.
I love this stuff.
It's really important. It's nice that, it can make the code across your entire deployment uniform, and it can help you find bugs that you otherwise wouldn't be able to catch. So the first part I want to talk about is using the style guide. Puppet has an official style guide. It hasn't been updated in a little while, and it is currently being revised. Nevertheless, if you don't have a style guide, it's an excellent place to start. We vary from it a little bit at Mozilla, which is perfectly fine, as long as we're comfortable with that, which we absolutely are. But it's an excellent place to start. If you have no style guide, I would definitely recommend at least reading it, and maybe you want to diverge from it a little bit too. But it allows you, just like any style guide, to be able to have multiple people on a team and to be writing code and to lower the difficulty of reading somebody else's code.
Anybody here program Perl? Perl programmers? Yeah? There's a handful. Okay. How many of you have written something that someone else can't read? If you're a Perl programmer, the answer is you. Okay? This is a problem. Are there style guides? Yeah, of course there are. Anybody follow? No. This is a mistake you want to avoid. All right? If you don't like the Puppet style guide, that's fine. You don't have to use it. All right? Just use a style guide. Implement one. Find a coding style, find a syntax style, document it, put it on your company's wiki, make sure everybody uses it. That way you can avoid being a Perl programmer. Fair enough?
We have a Mozilla style guide if you want to use ours.
We do. Ours is not bad.
Yeah. Additionally, there's built-in parser validation, and parser validation is really cool because before you go, say you wrote some Puppet code and you wrote like a 100-line diff, and you're not sure if there's a single bug in there. And if you don't use this, the only way you're really going to know is if you try to deploy it and things just fall on the floor and break.
Boom.
And so the validation allows you to, it'll tell you if there's a syntax error, maybe you missed a quote or something like that. And this is really important, and we use this. We reject anything that doesn't follow this.
Exactly.
Which is our next point, which is the style checks. And so we have code repositories for our Puppet files, and if we try to check in a Puppet file that doesn't pass validation, the commit is just rejected, which is nice because it means that someone can't break it and falls asleep, and
falls asleep at the wheel.
We have to come back later and fix it with no context.
Exactly. So let's talk a little bit about the parser validation. It's an important point. So obviously we've introduced you to it.
Yeah.
There you
Yeah.
go. Puppet,
This is
parser, validate, manifest.pp. It's built into Puppet. It's built in. If you have Puppet, you have this. Therefore, there's no excuse for not implementing it. All right? Don't write your manifest, hundreds of lines, you got your support libraries, get everything like this is the best code ever. You put it into your source code repository, let's deploy it, boy, does that ever not work. Why? Because you missed the comma somewhere. That sucks. All right? So before you commit all of your code, before you do everything, run your validation. That's going to tell you exactly what is going to happen when you try to deploy it onto your nodes and it blows up. Avoid that problem. Do it on your local machine, you're fine. And it's going to spit out, it's going to spit out something like this. Very simple. Cannot parse environment, production, syntax error, blah. Pretty straightforward. It's going to tell you what the problem is, where it is. Doesn't get any simpler than that. It's been alluded to.
Right.
Put this in your hooks.
Yes.
Put this in your hooks.
Right. And no output means everything's okay, so small side note.
No news is good news.
Exactly. The next slide, and kind of relating to this, is linting. There's a very cool tool called Puppet Lint, and whereas the syntax is just going to see if it's parsable and Puppet can make sense of it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's human readable. And so this is just a little tool that you can use that will make sure that your spacing is correct and your spaceship operators all line up, and you're not more than 80 characters on each line, that sort of thing. And so here are some of the things that you can expect to see if you've never linted your code before.
Exactly. What does Puppet Lint actually do? In a nutshell, it takes a look at what the style guide proposes, the official Puppet style guide, mind you, takes a look at your code and sees if it lines up. Right? Does your code look like what the Puppet style guide thinks it's supposed to look like? If it does, no output. If it doesn't, stuff like this. All right, this is a Ruby gem, very easy to install, very easy to use. So you don't like gems, that's cool. It's on GitHub. You can roll your own, that's fine. You can turn each of the things that it checks for on and off, either as command line arguments or as a simple .configuration file. So for example, if your particular style guide doesn't care about auto-load syntax documentation, ours doesn't, for example, you can just turn that check off. So it's actually quite malleable. It can work for you, not against you. That's the critical thing here. So again, the previous slide, that's computer readability, right? Does the computer have the capability to read your manifest? That's nice. This is human readability. Can a human read your manifest? That's better. It's better.
And our next point, we're going to talk a little bit about modules and tools about building modules.
Time for tools. Modules for making other modules. All right? So you programmer, you probably have some point in your career used a library. Might have happened. I mean, unless you're a pure assembler programmer, in which case kudos to you. Okay? Puppet has libraries. It has all sorts of things as well that can help make your life easier if you're rolling your own modules. Puppet Concat.
Right. Puppet Concat is there to solve a very common problem with anyone who's ever tried to use. Okay. Cool. We have a next slide.
We do.
And it's standard lib is another one. And I'm going to talk about Puppet Concat. You can talk about standard lib since that's your bread and butter. Puppet Concat is a nice little tool for managing configuration files, and it dynamically builds them. So if you're using a daemon that doesn't support something like a .d directory, so etc mysql.d could have many files in it, and each file would be responsible for a very small part of mysql.conf. Many daemons don't support this sort of thing, and so Concat is for building those yourself. And you could basically specify where each fragment should come from, where the target should be, and the order that they should be interpreted in. And this is a really common pattern that we use in many of our Puppet modules. So we can see that we're specifying config file there, and those are the two fragments, and they're in order.
Couldn't be more simple, right? Need to build a text file, configuration file, for example. A lot of configurations follow the same syntax, right? Key value store, for example. Easy to build with this. The example here, you want to walk us through it?
Sure. This example, we're defining a config file at the top, which is going to be our target, basically. And each of these fragments is going to go into that. And we're specifying each fragment later. So we're specifying concat and the subclass of fragment, and we have the header of our file, and we tell it where to go find the content, where to go find the content for the header for that, and what the target is supposed to be. And then the last line here is the ordering. So it just it collects all of these, and then it goes through them in order, and then puts them into this config file in the order, numerical order, basically.
Yeah. Again, it seems pretty straightforward. That's because it is. It's designed to be easy to use. It's designed to be useful. Right? You don't want to be messing around. You need to build a configuration file. You want at the top a little hash sign, this file managed by Puppet will be overwritten, blah, blah, blah. Don't create work for yourself by putting all of those configuration files into Puppet. Puppet is not a file distribution mechanism. You can distribute files with it, but that's not what it's for. Puppet's programmatic. Use it to build configuration files. Much more reusable, much more generic, much more extensible. Puppet concat.
Standard lib.
Standard lib. Oh god, I love standard lib so much. Standard lib. Most programming languages, environments, so on and so forth, have something like a standard lib, right? It's a standard collection of things. Puppet comes with things. Puppet comes with different types of functions and different types of facets and different types of whatever, okay? And it comes with a base selection of them. That base selection is very powerful. You can do a lot of things with it. Standard lib takes that base collection and makes more useful things out of it. I head off the question before it happens, why isn't standard lib part of the base Puppet distribution? I don't know. It isn't. So you need to acquire it. You can acquire it from the Puppet Forage, from GitHub. It's very easy. It's curated by Puppet Labs. So it's something that they themselves vet and distribute. Very useful. Okay? It contains stages, facets, functions, definitions, types, providers, everything's in there. I have some. There we go. Standard library, widely used, curated by Puppet Labs. Sorry, I should have paused through on that. There are, for example, some functions which are is underscore something. All right? Reprogrammer, you know that it does duck typing. Advantages and disadvantages of duck typing are many and numerous. Okay? So this is underscore star. It's very useful. Is underscore Boolean. Feed it the variable. Is underscore hash. Feed it the variable. This comes in super, super handy when you're building your manifests, especially when you're using your parameterized classes. Right? You're feeding data into the class. The variable name is ensure. Ensure is a Boolean, right? It's either true or false, generally speaking. But somebody in your organization's like, ensure? I don't know, maybe. That's a string. All right? And if you try to use it like a Boolean, it's not going to work. So inside of your manifest, if you're using standard lib, you can check for that. Determine if that incoming variable is in fact a Boolean, right? Sanity preservation. There's a zillion interesting functions in standard lib to interact with arrays, hashes, do merges, you name it. I highly recommend you check it out. It's very, very powerful. And the last point I want to make about it is that if you're getting modules from Puppet Forage, you're acquiring modules from GitHub that you're going to be implementing in your environment, a lot of them require standard lib because it's just the module you use to make other modules. Fair enough? Sanity preservation.
Yep.
Preserve your sanity.
These are more concepts more than they are tools that you can use. We were talking about earlier. And so the first one was we covered a little bit with our parameterized classes in that that's use default values. I've often written modules in which I could use default values for everything I pass to it, which is really nice because it makes it easy for someone to test and deploy. Other times you can't quite get away with that, but you should still try to use default values as much as possible.
Exactly. Second one is one I alluded to just previously, which is verify content. Verify incoming content. Again, if you're one guy or girl and you've got a Puppet installation and you're writing your manifests and you can trust yourself to input the right types of information into the right places, that's great. But in any sufficiently large environment, which is to say, 2 people or more, I dare say, you can't necessarily trust humans to make the right decision all the time. We're humans, we make mistakes. So you should verify incoming content. Is it a Boolean? Is it a hash? Great. Is it supposed to be a string? It is a string. But is the contents of the string what we expect it to be? Okay? Don't blindly put stuff onto the machine if you can avoid it. Verify the incoming content. Standard lib helps you to do that. You could write your own libraries to do that. There's even ways within the base Puppet system to do it with regexes and things of this nature. Verify incoming content. Very important.
We have one final point, and that's mutually exclusive declarations. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I do, actually. Mutually exclusive declarations. This is a good one. Remember how I said data and logic should be separate? Good, because they are separate. Now let's talk just about logic. All right? Logic paths. Right? That's what computers do. They follow paths, and they come to an output, and they come to a result, and that's very nice. It is entirely possible, happens all the time, to write a module that can do, ready for this? More than one thing. All right? Depending on the incoming variables, depending on the data you're feeding it, different types of output are going to come out. And it's entirely possible, fairly common even, for a module to do things which are logically exclusive. For one logic path, once you follow it, to be exclusive from the other one. The twain should not meet. They'll collide. They'll break things. So if you have logic which is mutually exclusive, it must be programmatically exclusive. Again, this makes sense. But you have to implement it in Puppet space. You have to do it inside of your manifests. And generally what that ends up meaning is a whole bunch of if-then-elses. All right? The Puppet DSL supports these basic sorts of logic structures. Do not be afraid to use them. Don't just blindly spit out files to a machine. Don't blindly take action on a machine. Right? You set your default values. You verify the incoming content. Go that extra mile and create logic trees. It's a safety mechanism.
Next spot is slightly a little bit different. We're going to be talking about log output, and Puppet is really nice in that it allows log output to have many different methods. So you have here. I'll start with this, in that it's informative and human readable, and that basically means that you can specify the format that it gives you is nice, and that is a base for being human readable, and it allows you to insert your own human readable messages without having it mangled through some sort of archaic log mechanism.
Anybody here a Java programmer? Java programmer, program in Java, right? Error messages? Yeah. That's a problem, isn't it? You're going to have like maybe some Python output. It's a couple pages long. The problem's in there somewhere, right? Puppet will do that to you, okay? The problem's in there somewhere, but where?
Right. The next level is the next slide or talking point is log levels, and we have all the nice ones here. We have critical levels in which you should probably show in pretty much every circumstance. We have warnings, which we could maybe show if we're trying to solve some problems, and there's informative ones, which you probably don't care to see unless you're trying to debug something rather esoteric.
The functions that allow you to send messages from Puppet to whatever mimic the syslog functions. They're the same. So if you're familiar with syslog logging, the different sorts of error levels that there are, Puppet uses the same ones. The biggest thing to take away from this is that you can make your own log messages. All right? When you make your manifests, there are Puppet functions. The Puppet function, for example, for making a notify level log is
Notify.
For making an level log is okay? So you've created your logic trees. They're mutually exclusive. You've verified your variables, so on and so forth. Variables are coming in. It's not what it should be. Guess what? We were expecting a Boolean. It's not a Boolean. Spit out an error message. Something you can read that's useful to you. Handy.
Yep. These come in very useful when you're trying to do input validation, which we mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
The final point about it is that they do some really interesting things in terms of aggregation and rotation. Puppet has several methods of doing this, and you can have it send emails. You can have it sit on the Puppet master. We have them go through an IRC bot and complain to us, that sort of thing.
Be creative. Yeah, why not, right? 2012.
Yeah,
all this stuff, man.
and there are many modules out there and scripts on GitHub about companies really like to show off how they've set Puppet up, and this is one of the things that they show off, is how they get informed about things when they go wrong.
We got a rule. There's a lot of information, so we're on tiered manifest approach.
Right along.
Oof. Okay. Yeah, this is a big one. Doink, doink. All right, so the idea behind this is pretty straightforward. I'll run through it as quickly as I can. Node definitions in Puppet, right? Node space, the name of your machine, what's on that. As simple as possible. It's very important. Write that down. Node definitions should be as simple as possible, as bare bones as they can be. Okay? You don't want to be including logic. You don't want to be putting your weird data in there. That's a no-no, right? You should use profile or intermediary classes. Set up manifests which describe groups of machines. Okay? So that when you have node, okay, we're running out of time. When you have node regex, your 50 web server machines, includes class, the profile class. Inside the profile class, that's where you're going to put all your modules. That's where you're going to start pulling in variable data. Can somebody tell me concretely how much time we have left? Minus 20. We have minus 20 left. All right. Are we done?
We can keep going. Or
testing's important. Puppet as a source of truth. All right, Puppet data library. Build a Puppet ecosystem. You know what? If you want to talk about this stuff, I love talking about this stuff. Set ourselves up in the hackerspace. All right. We can sit. I'll fire up Puppet on a machine. We can sit down. We can show you all this stuff. It's going to be awesome. If you want to play around with it a little bit more, you want to talk about it a little more, inventory services. We've got run report services. We've got visualization tools. All right. These are the last things we want to talk about. What's the take home on this discussion? Separate your data and your logic. Critical, critical, critical. All right? Consistent code standards. Critical. Puppet-based ecosystem. We didn't get to talk about it. Critical. Questions? We'll talk about that after. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.